Boldwood presents Love Blossoms at Puddleduck Farm, written by Della Galton and read by Karen Cass. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Did you know guinea pigs come from deepest, darkest Peru, where they are not pets, but a source of protein, and they can even break dance? Young Archie Holt paused for breath and looked at Phoebe, who was kneeling on the lawn beside him. She raised her eyebrows, taking all this in, as Archie lifted a plump brown guinea pig out of its pen, which was in front of them, and plonked it onto Phoebe's lap. His dark eyes were expectant. "I didn't know they could break dance," Phoebe replied, running her fingers over the sleek brown coat and decidedly curvy belly of her patient. It was not the most orthodox of consultations, kneeling as they were out in the early April fresh air on the bowling green grass of the beautiful back lawns of Beechbrook House. Phoebe was more used to examining her patients in her spotless consulting rooms at Puddleduck Vets, which was at Puddleduck Farm next door, but she would have forgiven 10-year-old Archie for most things. She'd had a soft spot for him for even longer than she'd been dating his father, Rufus Holt, who was currently ensconced in his home office, oblivious to the goings-on in his back garden. "Can this guinea pig break dance?" Phoebe asked Archie cautiously. He grinned at her and then shrugged. "Maybe. I've never seen her, but I saw one do it on TikTok." Of course he had. TikTok was Archie's current favourite social media platform. Phoebe glanced back into the pen where she could see at least two of Archie's other guinea pigs, Elastigirl and Edna. He was a fan of The Incredibles, before returning her attention to the one on her lap. "She's new, this one, isn't she? What's her name?" "Violet." He was still on the same theme for names then. "Archie, did you realise that Violet was pregnant?" Phoebe looked at him curiously. As far as she knew, Archie didn't have any male guinea pigs, certainly none he'd registered with Puddleduck Vets. Mind you, she hadn't seen Violet before today either. Archie nodded. "Yes, I know she is. Lucius is the father." Phoebe seemed to remember Lucius was a character in The Incredibles too. "And where is Lucius?" "He's not here. He belongs to my mate Jack." Archie grinned. "We're sharing the profits when the little pigs are sold. We've set up a spreadsheet to factor in the costs of food and hay and stuff. Jack isn't getting as much of a cut as me. Technically, I could just pay him the stud fee, seeing as I've got all the—" "I see." Phoebe wondered if Rufus knew about any of this. She'd been under the impression that he'd been trying to keep the lid on Archie's ever-increasing menagerie. He had 2 rabbits as well, both males, fortunately. But then maybe Rufus figured letting Archie breed guinea pigs was a good way to teach his son entrepreneurial skills. "Guinea pigs have an average gestation period of 69 days, Archie continued knowledgeably. "And when the little pigs are born, they have all their fur and teeth and stuff and can run around in the first hour." He hunkered back on his heels, frowning slightly. Phoebe nodded. From what she could remember about guinea pigs, Archie was spot on. There was a grass stain on his cheek. She resisted the urge to lean across and wipe it off. "Do you know how old Violet is?" 4 months, Archie said promptly. "It's the ideal breeding age for a sow, because once they go past 6 months of age, parts of the pelvis fuse up, and then they can't give birth." Phoebe suppressed a smile. He was correct about that too. Mind you, she would have expected nothing less. Archie didn't do anything by halves. Why would his breeding project be any different? "Do you know how long Violet's been pregnant so far?" She was no expert, but she'd have said Violet was about to pop. 71 days. Archie rubbed his nose, a gesture that Phoebe knew meant he was slightly anxious. "I was wondering if she might need some vet help." "She doesn't look as though she needs any help just yet, but you were right to get me to have a look. And you will need to keep a close eye on her over the next couple of days." It was a good job it was the Easter holidays. In 4 days' time, it was Good Friday, but Archie's school had a 2-week break. Archie must have planned ahead. I should probably transfer her to the nesting cage now then, Archie said solemnly. Do you think that's a good idea? My book says she needs to be separated from the others when she has her litter and for some time after the babies arrive to keep them all safe. I've got it all ready. I've put in chippings and stuff. Now is probably the right time, Phoebe said. She wasn't a bit surprised that Archie had it all planned out. He loved animals, and unlike some kids Phoebe encountered in her work, he was totally focused on their care. But she was even more sure now that Rufus couldn't have sanctioned this. He'd always seemed keen to curtail Archie's plans for a guinea pig emporium, and he certainly hadn't mentioned Violet's imminent litter. On the other hand, why would he? He had an estate to run. He tended to leave all things Archie to Amelia, Archie's Swiss-German nanny. There was only one way to find out. Phoebe took the bull by the horns. Archie's cheeks reddened. No. There was an awkward pause. You're not going to tell him, are you? His voice was pleading. Can't it be our secret? Please, Phoebe, please don't tell Dad. She took a deep breath. Out of the corner of her eye, she had just spotted movement. She turned to look. Amelia had just come out onto the terrace at the back of the house. Now she shielded her eyes and looked out across the grass. Her slim figure was in profile to them briefly. Then she saw them and began to march across the lawn, her blonde ponytail swaying crossly from side to side. Archie spotted her too. Uh-oh, he muttered. This was a sentiment with which Phoebe agreed. Despite her best efforts to be friendly towards the younger woman, Amelia was 29 to Phoebe's 36, Amelia had never been more than cool towards Phoebe, and her attitude had become even more glacial when she'd discovered that Phoebe and Rufus were an item. They'd begun dating last summer, 8 months ago, and although they'd kept it low-key, Amelia clearly did not approve of her boss's new girlfriend. In the beginning, Phoebe had put this down to her being overprotective of both Archie, who she'd looked after since his mother had died nearly 4 years ago, and also perhaps a little of Rufus, formerly known as one of the most eligible bachelors in the New Forest, being both a rich widower and in line to be the next Lord Holt. But Phoebe was no longer sure if it was just overprotectiveness. When Rufus was around, Amelia was friendly and pleasant, but as soon as he was absent, she found fault with everything that Phoebe did or said. If she hadn't known better, Phoebe would have said Amelia was ragingly jealous. She'd recently wondered if Amelia had had designs on Rufus herself. She hadn't mentioned this to Rufus, and as far as she could see, Rufus was never anything other than professional towards Archie's nanny, so it seemed unlikely. But Phoebe couldn't think of another explanation. Phoebe wasn't the type to get intimidated by people who didn't approve of her, but it was hard not to feel slightly unnerved by the nanny's unfriendly manner, and by the look of Amelia's body language as she strutted across the lawn towards them. She wasn't very happy today. Phoebe was gently lifting Violet back into her pen when Amelia arrived. Archie, there you are. You must tell me if you're vanishing from house. I worry. She looked down her nose at Phoebe, which wasn't difficult, as Phoebe was still on her knees. I did not know you were here. She made it sound as though Phoebe should apologize for not informing her, which Phoebe had no intention of doing. Is this visit of the professional or the personal? A bit of both. That was obvious. She worked next door when Archie texted me. About the mini pig, yeah? Amelia glanced into the pen. Archie, if the vet is called, you must tell me. These things are expensive. There won't be a charge, Phoebe said quickly. Ignoring her, Amelia went on. Should the mini pig be this heavy? That is not right. Wait. Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. Is this mini pig with babies, Archie? Archie, who'd got to his feet when Amelia had arrived, put his hands in his pockets, and after a moment's hesitation, he nodded. He seemed to realize that there wasn't much point in denying it, especially as Violet was now waddling her way across to see her companions, her brown belly swaying very obviously. Poof! Amelia said, How did this happen? Phoebe winced. Amelia puffed again. You knew about this? She turned her laser gaze on Phoebe. "You have come, without Rufus knowing, to check pregnant mini-pig." Phoebe stood up. On her feet, she was taller than the haughty blonde nanny, which helped equal things out a little. "I'm just going to talk to Rufus now," she said, realizing that if she told Amelia she hadn't known about Violet's condition, she'd be dropping Archie in it, and if she said she had known, then she'd be giving Amelia all the evidence of collusion she needed. She was definitely going to have to tell Rufus, though. However much Archie had planned to keep this under wraps, it couldn't stay a secret any longer. Archie had suddenly become very interested in something on the lawn and was scuffing at it with the toe of his trainer. Behind him, in the distance, Phoebe saw one of the gardeners come out of the shed on the sit-on mower and reverse it into position. At the same time, her mobile buzzed in her pocket. Phew, saved by the bell. Phoebe hooked it out just in time to see the name Annie Buckland flick up on the screen. Annie Buckland, owner of Annie's Alpacas, was a new customer, but Phoebe had given Annie her direct number because she'd been over there a few times lately to treat an old cat. "Sorry," Phoebe told both Archie and Amelia, "but I need to get this." 20 minutes later, Phoebe was driving her Lexus between the newly planted lavender fields on either side of the quarter-mile drive that led towards the gatehouse of the Beechbrook estate. The lavender bushes, planted in dozens and dozens of straight rows, were a new venture for Rufus. They wouldn't bloom until June, ready for their first harvest in July, but they would look and smell stunning when they did. Rufus had plans for upmarket skincare products and had negotiated a deal with an artisan cooperative. She drove past the gatehouse and on beneath the high stone archway, topped by a... It still felt a little bit surreal, coming in and out of the estate, as though she lived there, when, up until last year, she'd spent her whole life wondering what lay beyond the imposing brick wall that circled it. Phoebe had only got the chance to see Rufus very briefly. He'd been on an extended phone call himself, but she'd waited until he'd ended it, and then given him a quick update on Archie's breeding enterprise. He'd reacted with a mixture of frustration and amusement. As Phoebe had suspected, Archie hadn't mentioned his guinea pig breeding project to his father, but she'd got the impression, when she'd filled him in, that Rufus was secretly quite proud of his son's ingenuity. "I'd have said no if he'd asked me," Rufus had said, smiling ruefully, which is, of course, why he didn't ask me. "But maybe it's not such a bad thing. At least he'll have done it all properly. Conscientiously, that is, as far as the animal is concerned." He'd flicked a glance at her. "Thanks for coming over. Was the guinea pig okay?" "She was fine, you're right. He had done everything by the book." "I will tell Archie that he can't just go calling you whenever he feels like it, though. He can't just get free veterinary advice whenever he likes just because we're friendly." "Actually, he can," she had said, smiling. "I don't mind." "Well, I do. It's a boundary. Besides, it would be good for him to learn that veterinary advice is a cost he needs to factor into his business plan. Did you say he'd set up this breeding program with Jack?" "Yes, apparently they have a spreadsheet." Rufus shook his head. "Amazing. Okay, I'll speak to him. Thanks for the heads up." She had moved across to his side of the enormous walnut desk where he was sitting and kissed him on the nose. "I've got to go. I've got a call. If there are any problems with that guinea pig, let me know. But fingers crossed, there won't be." Rufus nodded. "Thanks again, I will. See you later." "I'm looking forward to it." Something Rufus said had niggled Phoebe as she drove towards Annie Buckland's, which was on the Lyndhurst side of the New Forest, about half an hour away. But it wasn't until she was almost at the farm that she realised what it was. Archie can't get free veterinary advice whenever he likes, just because we're friendly. It was the word friendly that was bothering her, she realised. Was that how Rufus saw their relationship? Friendly? She'd rather hoped he saw it as a bit more than friendly. He was just as attractive to Phoebe as he'd been on that very first kiss, but she was beginning to wonder if the chemistry had faded for him. Part of the problem was that they were hardly ever alone. They still only saw each other a couple of times a week. This, despite the fact that Phoebe lived at Woodcutter's Cottage, a 10-minute drive away from Beechbrook House, and she worked next door. Phoebe had her own vet practice, and Rufus had a son and a huge estate to run, and neither of them could spare much time away from what was effectively a 24/7 commitment. Phoebe knew they were no nearer to resolving the problem of not enough time than they'd been on their first Christmas together, when, thanks to a dozen impossible-to-break prior commitments, they'd barely seen each other. She shook her head. Of course Rufus didn't see them as just friendly, Phoebe told herself firmly. It was a turn of phrase, nothing more. With a small sigh, Phoebe parked below the painted sign that proclaimed you'd reached Annie's alpacas and checked to make sure she had no more messages. She'd recently taken on a newly qualified vet, Max Jones, to work full-time at her surgery. Max was hugely enthusiastic, passionate about animal welfare, and she already trusted him enough to leave him and her senior vet nurse, Jenna, holding the fort while she did the farm call-outs. She had to admit she was loving the freedom of getting out and about. Small animal practice was great, but it consisted mostly of dogs, cats, and the occasional rabbit, with allergies, digestive problems, and minor injuries. Much of it was routine, and it was nowhere near as varied as going out to farms, seeing the animals on their own turf, literally usually, and never being quite sure what you would find. Phoebe found 2 messages on her phone. One was from Marcus, her receptionist, asking if Annie had got hold of her about an alpaca that was off its food. Phoebe texted back to say she was there now. The other was a message from Archie with a link to a TikTok video headed up, Bill, the brilliant breakdancing guinea pig. It was very hard to resist the temptation to open the link immediately. Chapter 2. Phoebe had been introduced to Annie Buckland by Maggie Crowther, her grandmother. Maggie was the owner of Puddleduck Farm, which for the last 14 years had been an unofficial animal sanctuary, taking in waifs and strays from the surrounding New Forest villages. Last year, with Phoebe's help, it had become more official. It had been rechristened Puddleduck Pets, and now did animal sponsorship as well as animal adoptions, and it was slowly becoming a more sustainable charity. Last year, Phoebe had also had an old barn at her grandmother's farm converted into a modern vet unit, with consulting rooms and operating theatre, and she now rented the space from Maggie, which helped both of them. It meant that Phoebe could keep an eye out for the old lady, although Maggie would have denied she needed any eyes kept out for her, and it also meant that Phoebe had achieved her dream of owning her own veterinary practice. Prior to this, Phoebe had worked 30 minutes away at Marchwood Vets, a big practice on the New Forest side of Southampton, where he'd been thrilled when Phoebe had set up her own practice and had even cut the ribbon at the official opening. The 2 practices, Marchwood and Puddleduck Vets, worked closely together, doing each other's out-of-hours cover and passing on clients in each other's areas. There was a lot of word-of-mouth business in the New Forest, and there were a lot of families who had been there for years. The forest people, especially the farmers, looked out for each other. They were a close-knit community. Annie Buckland had rehomed a border terrier from Maggie several years ago, and although the dog had since died, the 2 women still kept in touch. "Annie's a quirky old soul," Maggie had told Phoebe before she'd set off on her first visit to Buckland Farm. "I'd go as far as to say she was totally bonkers, but she's got a good heart, I'll say that for her." "Takes one to know one," Phoebe had quipped. "On both fronts, I mean." She'd slanted a glance at her grandmother, who insisted on being called Maggie by everyone, even her granddaughter. But Maggie had rolled her eyes and refused to rise to the bait. "You'll see what I mean when you meet her," was all she would say. Annie Buckland, Phoebe had discovered, looked like an old-fashioned Romany gypsy, which she'd later discovered was precisely what she was. It was hard to tell how old she was, somewhere between her late 60s and mid-70s. She had dark eyes, olive skin, and gorgeous ringleted black hair, very gently touched with grey. And if you were to glance at any of the dozens of framed pictures around her spacious hall, which Phoebe had on the first occasion she'd visited, You could see that it was a look that had come down through the generations. Glamorous women, handsome men, and beautiful, slow-eyed children smiled or gazed broodingly out from family scenes. Annie was proud of her Romany ancestry and happy to chat about it. Her grandmother had told fortunes and read tarot on the beach in high season at Scarborough, apparently, and there was a line of the family that had inherited the gift and was still in great demand. Madame Kezia was the real deal, Annie had told Phoebe proudly the first time they'd met. None of your pseudo-nonsense with wigs and gold earrings. No, none of that. Madame Kezia read the palms of the stars. Hugely well-known celebrities who paid a fortune, if you'll excuse the pun, for her skill. She had reeled off a list of people who Phoebe had never heard of, but had pretended to know because Annie was a sweetie and she liked her. "Did you inherit the gift?" Phoebe had asked, fascinated, and Annie had laughed. No, although I do get the occasional insight. If you were to bring round a prospective life partner to see me, I'd probably be able to tell you whether he was... Would you? Phoebe's thoughts had flicked instantly to Rufus, and she'd berated herself. She was already sure he was the one. She didn't need confirmation from Annie. Oh, yes, definitely. Annie's eyes had sparkled. But you'd need a bit more than the occasional insight to read palms for a living. Alpacas are a better bet. She'd confided she'd been proud of her heritage, but had traded it in to marry a New Forest farmer 4 decades ago. Nick came from 3 generations of sheep farmers, she'd told Phoebe, but we switched to alpacas a few years ago. They're our retirement project. Annie liked to chat. Boy, did she like to chat. And Phoebe, who liked people nearly as much as she liked animals, luckily was happy to listen. Besides, chatting was good for business. If the customer was happy and relaxed, they tended to invite you back. This was Phoebe's 3rd visit to the farm. The first one had been a few weeks ago to stitch a wound in a farm cat's neck, and the next to administer antibiotics when it wouldn't heal properly. A run-in with a rat, I expect, Annie had told Phoebe. Reuben's getting on a bit lately. He ain't so good at dispatching rats as he used to be, but in his head he's still a youngster. She'd been right about the rat bite, in Phoebe's opinion, and the antibiotics had seemed to do the trick. Phoebe had half expected, when she'd seen Annie's number flash up today, that she was being called out to see Reuben again. The cat must have been about 16, and he wasn't much bigger than a large rat himself. But, as it turned out, today's patient wasn't Reuben. Annie had said when they'd spoken that she had an alpaca that was off-colour. Phoebe had been called to see more and more alpacas lately. There was a trend in the UK for keeping them. They made great pets and were easy to keep. They were also renowned for disliking foxes, so quite often hobby hen keepers or smallholders kept them to protect their flocks of free-range chickens. They didn't have many health problems, and Phoebe wasn't expecting this alpaca to be any different. Annie loved her animals and was the kind of owner who'd call the vet at the first sign of a problem. But when she met Phoebe at the door, her usual smiley face was sombre. "Hello, love, thanks for coming out so quick. I'm worried about Cindy." "Oh dear," Phoebe said, clutching her vet bag and following her client past the gallery of pictures and along a narrow hall that smelled of cats, through the old farmhouse kitchen and out of the back door once more. "What seems to be the problem?" Phoebe asked, as they tramped across a yard and down the track which led to the alpaca field, stopping briefly for Annie to grab a bucket and halter. "I'm not sure, but she's just not her usual self. She's off her food, not like her at all, and she seems a bit..." Annie frowned. "Nick said I was imagining it at first, but I knew I wasn't. I'll show you." They paused at the 5-bar gate of the smaller field. The Bucklands had 14 Suri alpacas, which were the type with the corkscrew coats, and the herd was split across their 7 acres of land. During the time they'd been in business, they'd bred several greys, which was the most coveted colour of fleece, Phoebe had learned, but they also had other colours, ranging from fawn to dark brown to black. They mostly sold fleeces, but they also bred beautiful alpacas to sell on. There was a scattering of small trees currently bedecked in pink blossom, looking like giant sticks of candy floss dotted across the fields. It was the most idyllic scene, like something out of the darling buds of May, Phoebe thought, as she looked out across the small holding. Today, 6 of the alpacas, including Cindy, were grazing at the far end of the smallest field. Phoebe shielded her eyes against the midday sun to look. Patients on farms were always at the far ends of fields, Phoebe had learned, and if they weren't when you arrived, they soon put themselves there. Animals had an unerring instinct for knowing when the vet was around and putting as much distance as possible between them. Or maybe it was the vet bag they recognized. Either way, they didn't hang around to say hello. Annie climbed over the fence, agile as a cat, the bucket and halter in one hand, and Phoebe followed suit. They'd had a lot of rain in April, and the ground by the gate was sodden and muddy. Thankfully, it wasn't raining now. As they approached, Annie banged the bucket, and a couple of the alpacas began to amble over. "Cindy's the black one on the right," Annie pointed out. "She's not very old. I hope she's okay." From a distance, Cindy didn't look much different from the rest of the herd, but as they got closer, Phoebe could see she did seem quieter than the rest. Neither was she as interested in the bucket Annie carried, although she did accept a handful of oats. "Cindy's as tame as a dog anyhow," Annie told Phoebe. "We've had her since she was a tiny cria, so I didn't think there'd be a problem catching her." She slipped a halter over the alpaca's nose. "Do you want her inside, or can you look at her here? The others will sod off once the bucket's empty." "Here should be fine, thanks." Phoebe unpacked a stethoscope from her bag. "Are you all right to hold her while I examine her?" "Of course." Annie held the alpaca's halter and buried her hand in the thick black fleece of her neck in a little gesture of affection. "But I don't think she'll move far." She was right. Cindy didn't object. Both were just slightly out of the normal range, but not wildly. "How long has she been off her food?" "A few days, maybe a week. I wasn't too worried at first, but it's going on a bit now, and I don't think she's as lively as usual. Some days she seems okay, but others not. What do you think might be wrong?" "I'm not sure yet. Has she been wormed lately?" "Yes, I think so." While Annie held Cindy securely, Phoebe checked the obliging alpaca's eyelids and saw they looked a little paler than they should have done. "She's slightly anemic," she told Annie. "I'm going to take a blood test, and then we can send it to the lab to confirm and test for what might be causing it." "Will that be expensive?" Annie looked alarmed. "Not too bad, but I think it's necessary. If she is anemic, we need to find out what's causing it, don't we?" "I suppose we do. How long will it take?" "About a week." "Okay, if that's what we have to do." Annie still sounded reluctant, and Phoebe wondered, not for the first time, how much of a shoestring the alpaca farm was run on. Okay, so she knew the Bucklands weren't far off retirement, but everywhere you looked, there were signs of decay. The fencing in the alpaca field was good, but there were bits in the unused fields alongside it that were broken and rotting. The barn they'd collected the bucket from had been falling down, and the farmhouse looked as if it needed a new roof. The whole place reminded Phoebe of how Puddleduck Farm had looked when she'd first moved back from London. Maggie had let things go at Puddleduck Farm because she was struggling for money. Phoebe wondered if the Bucklands were doing the same. Annie had paid her cash for Reuben's treatment, counting the notes out from a tin in her kitchen. "Don't tell Nick how much it cost if you bump into him," she'd quipped. But Phoebe had caught the underlying seriousness of her words. "He's always on at me for spending money on the animals." There was a world of difference in cost between treating an alpaca and a cat. Phoebe found herself hoping fervently that whatever was wrong with Cindy wouldn't take long to diagnose and wouldn't be too pricey. She took the bloods from the long-suffering Cindy, not a totally simple matter when you had to get through the thick fleece first, and popped the blood tube safely in her bag. We'll soon get you sorted out, she murmured, as much to reassure Annie as for the animal's sake. She turned back to Annie. I'm going to prescribe some iron supplements. I can get them dropped off to you later on, or you can come into the surgery to pick them up in about an hour. She'll need to be started on them straight away. Try not to worry. I'm sure we'll soon get to the bottom of this. Annie nodded. Okay, she sounded relieved. How's your grandmother? She added, as they got back to the 5-bar gate. Away on a cruise around the Caribbean, Phoebe replied. She never is. Annie looked at her in amazement, and Phoebe paused for dramatic effect before saying, No, you're right. She's on a canal boat in the Norfolk Broads, but she told me to say she's cruising in the Caribbean, should anyone ask. Annie laughed. I don't blame her. I'd probably do the same. Not that there's anything wrong with the canal boat on the Norfolk Broads. Has she gone on her own? Who's looking after the animals? Natasha, her manager, is living on site temporarily, and no, she's gone with a friend. Phoebe decided not to elaborate on this. Maggie had actually gone with Eddie, who, back in the day when Puddleduck had been a working dairy farm, had worked as a farmhand. The two of them had always been firm friends, but last year, to Phoebe's delight, they'd got closer than friends. Her grandmother had spent 14 years alone since the death of Farmer Pete, who died just after their retirement. Phoebe was thrilled that she and Eddie had decided to start stepping out, as Maggie called it. Well, I hope she has a wonderful time, Annie said, and Phoebe realised they were back at the yard. Give her my best when you see her. I'll see you at the surgery in about an hour. I'll have the prescription ready for you, Phoebe said. Thanks, love, and thanks for coming so quickly. No problem. And don't worry, I'm sure we'll soon get to the bottom of this. I'm sure you will too. There was a mixture of gratitude and trust in Annie's dark eyes, and Phoebe really hoped it wasn't misplaced. Chapter 3. Phoebe was back at Puddleduck Farm just before 5 p.m. As she let herself in through the glass double doors of Puddleduck Vets, she saw Max talking to a pretty dark-haired woman with an absolutely irresistible golden Labrador puppy in the waiting room alongside reception. Max Jones may have only worked for her for 3 months, but he was already a big hit with Phoebe's female clients. He wasn't your classic heartthrob, with his sandy-coloured hair and Roman nose, but he was a very snappy dresser. Verging on preppy, he was a big fan of designer labels. He wore Ralph Lauren shirts to work under his scrubs, and he had a voice to die for. Phoebe would have described it as Oxbridge plus sunshine. He sounded exactly like Hugh Grant, but in a very good mood. He was also incredibly kind and passionate, and he took the time to make every patient, or rather patient's owner, feel special. Right now he was crouched in the middle of the waiting room, petting the pup's head, and the owner, kneeling opposite, was gazing at him adoringly, eyelashes fluttering, and looking like... Every puppy is different, Max was saying. Some pick it up straight away, and some take longer. But Sammy's an intelligent little chap. I'm sure he'll get it in no time. The thing to remember is that they have very small bladders at this age, so the occasional accident is inevitable. I see, the woman was saying. Yes, of course. Her face was rapt, as if a discussion about house training her puppy was the most fascinating thing she had ever heard. So you wouldn't be putting a time limit on it then? No, definitely not. It's like potty training a toddler. They all learn at their own pace. Have you got toddlers then? More eyelash fluttering. You don't look old enough to have any kids of your own. Max chuckled. Thank you, and no, I don't have any, but my sister does, so I do know a bit about it. More chuckling, more eyelash fluttering. Phoebe wondered if Max realised he was being checked out and chatted up. Behind him she could see Marcus, her receptionist, who was behind the desk, rolling his eyes. Marcus Peterson, who was 29, 3 years Max's junior, wasn't bad-looking himself, but he wasn't a woman magnet. Marcus had intense brown eyes, a crew cut, and always wore a suit to work. Marcus was definitely high street, not designer. Buttoned up would have been a good description for Marcus, or at least Phoebe had thought that about him when she'd first offered him a job, and he'd insisted on calling her Miss Dashwood and Maggie Mrs. Crowther. Once he'd loosened up a bit, she'd discovered that behind his formal exterior lay a very sharp wit and a fine sense of humour. He was also passionate about animals, but he didn't have the same effect on women that Max did, that was for sure. Phoebe exchanged smiles with both Max and Labrador Lady, who got up when they saw her and began to move towards the door, still chatting, still flirting, or at least the woman was still flirting. She clearly didn't want to leave. Phoebe went across to join Marcus behind reception. "Everything okay here?"
"Everything's cool?"
He frowned and nodded towards the couple at the door.
"What does he have that I don't?"
"I've no idea," Phoebe lied as convincingly as she could, "but it's obviously good for business. Has she been here long?"
"Her appointment finished 10 minutes ago, but she was the last."
The woman was laughing now. "Oh, you're so funny, Mr. Jones," she said when she finally paused for breath. "That's priceless. Have you ever considered doing behavioural training as a sideline or writing a book?"
"I think being a vet is probably enough."
Max managed to sound both self-deprecating, and he shut the door behind them. As he strolled back towards the reception desk, Marcus pointed at his mouth with 2 fingers and mimed retching.
"How does he do it? Phoebe, do you think I should get a Ralph Lauren shirt?" "It's not the shirt."
Was Max actually blushing?
"Miss Harper was just keen to get her puppy sorted out." "Keen to get in your trousers, you mean?"
Marcus gave a mock sigh. Max shook his head.
"No, I really don't think so. I think she was genuinely interested in the best way to house train her puppy."
He looked at Phoebe.
"We should offer that service, Phoebe, don't you think?"
"House training puppies?"
"No, pet behavioural training. There's a huge demand for it, and I think it's something that your grandmother would find useful too, for animals that come into the sanctuary. What do you think, Phoebe?"
Warming to his theme, he continued before she could answer.
"Dogs and cats are often given up because they have behavioural issues. If we were affiliated with a behaviourist, we could iron out any issues before animals were rehomed and preempt any future problems."
Phoebe bit her lip, but she didn't interrupt. Max looked so enthusiastic that she didn't want to burst his bubble. And it certainly sounded like a good idea on paper. The sanctuary rehomed lots of animals, and he was right. They often came in with behavioural problems. Saddam, a huge ginger Tom who roamed free on the farm, except when the small dogs were being exercised, was a classic example. He'd been dumped in a taped-up box by the gate a few years earlier. Half feral and totally furious, he'd exploded from his prison when Maggie had opened the box, scratching her on the way, and no one had been able to tame him since. Saddam hadn't become too much of a problem, though, until he'd started terrorising the small dogs. So last year, they'd hired Catty the cat whisperer to come out and see him. That hadn't gone well, so now he had to be kept in the barn when the small dogs were out and about.
"And if the practice could recommend a good behaviourist," Max was saying now, "it would be an extra service for our customers." "The sanctuary has tried a behaviourist before," Marcus chipped in, resting his elbows on the desk and giving Max a challenging stare. "It didn't go well. Catty the cat whisperer lasted about 5 minutes before Saddam sent her packing, legging it on her high heels with a torn stocking."
"How did you know about that?" Phoebe stared at him in surprise. "You weren't even working here then."
"Saddam's a legend," Marcus said happily. "I've heard all about his exploits from Maggie and Natasha."
His voice softened as he mentioned Natasha. If she wasn't mistaken, Marcus had a soft spot for Natasha.
"A behaviourist with high heels and stockings was obviously the wrong kind of person," Max said quickly. "Maybe someone here could do a course." "I'd be up for a course," Marcus offered instantly.
"It's certainly something I'd consider," Phoebe said. Let's talk about it properly when we've got some more time. I need to sort out some iron tablets for an alpaca. The client's coming in for them in a minute, and these bloods need to go off for testing. Did you arrange the lab courier?
Yup. Marcus looked at the clock. He'll be here in 10 minutes. And I need to tell you about a weird call I had earlier.
Phoebe's ears pricked up. Oh?
Long story short, it was from a man who wants to register 2 cooney pigs while he's on an extended break in the New Forest.
What was weird about it?
The guy, really. He wanted me to give him your mobile number, which I didn't, obviously, but I did promise you'd phone him back personally.
Why does he want to speak to me?
Well, for a start, he wanted your personal reassurance that we don't film consultations.
I assume you'd already told him that we didn't.
Yes, of course I did, but he wants a personal reassurance from you. If not, a signed affidavit, Marcus said, arching an eyebrow. I think the guy was a bit paranoid. Understatement. He looked at the bit of paper in front of him. His name's Mr. B. That was another weird thing.
B as in honeybee?
No, just the letter B. No first name either, or at least not one he'd give to me. I didn't push him. Marcus grinned. He sounded harmless enough, just a bit eccentric. To be honest, I quite like eccentrics.
Phoebe had to admit she did too. They had a few on their books. From the enigmatic Miss Alice Connor, who called all of her male animals Boris, after Britain's erstwhile Prime Minister, to the completely deaf Dusty Miller, who communicated in sign language and was an octogenarian protester. Mr. B and his coonies would probably fit in well. Shaking her head, she went through to the back to get the iron tablets. By the time Phoebe had caught up with Max, written up her call notes on the computer system, given Annie her iron tablets and locked up, it was just gone 6. She sat in her Lexus outside Puddleduck Farm and checked her messages. There was one from Rufus.
Thanks again for coming out to see Violet. No news yet. Apologies, but I've got to head out to a meeting. Dad was going to go, but he's not feeling well. Can we take a rain check on tonight?
Hoping there wasn't too much wrong with Lord Holt, she tapped back a reply. Of course we can. But she felt deflated. This happened way too often. Their plans were either cancelled or delayed. But if they couldn't even fit in a 2-hour date, how were they ever going to properly jigsaw their lives together? She consoled herself with the thought that at least they were going to spend Easter together. Max was on call for most of the Easter weekend, so although she was working Saturday, she had Friday, Sunday, and Monday off. 3 glorious days. On Sunday, Rufus and Archie were coming to meet the Dashwoods for lunch. The Dashwoods being her parents, James and Luella Dashwood, Fraser her brother, and Alexa her sister-in-law, and their twins. Maggie, who'd be back by then from the canal trip, was even bringing Eddie. The Dashwoods didn't usually do a lot for Easter, but this year they'd decided to push the boat out. Her parents were eager to meet Rufus properly, and her mother had offered to cook a big Sunday roast with all the trimmings. Phoebe knew it was because they were so happy for her, and she loved them for it. She was lucky enough to have been brought up in a very close-knit family. She'd always felt loved and supported by all of them, and she still felt like that now. Rufus had not been so lucky. His mother had died when he was 4 years old, and Rufus barely remembered her. His father, who'd never married again, had struggled to bring up his son, so had eventually sent him away to boarding school, which Rufus had hated. Stiff upper-lipped and dictatorial, Lord Alfred was not a touchy-feely kind of father. So even when Rufus was at home, he had felt isolated and ignored. He'd grown up feeling alone and unloved. The old lord had softened a bit when Rufus had married Rowena, the daughter of a very wealthy family of bankers, and they'd had Archie. Rufus had just begun to finally feel part of a family when tragedy had struck. By some terrible twist of fate, history had repeated itself. Rowena had died in a riding accident when Archie was barely 6. Rufus had been watching his wife at a cross-country event and had witnessed the whole thing, and he still suffered PTSD around horses. Because of his own experience, and despite what his father had advised, Rufus had refused to send Archie away to school. He went to a local private school,
and had instead hired the tetchy Amelia to look after him. From what Phoebe had seen, Archie was amazingly well-balanced, and although he often complained about his nanny and regularly dodged her, Phoebe suspected that he secretly respected Amelia and was actually quite fond of her. But Phoebe did ache sometimes for the autonomous little boy, growing up without a mother. He was so grown up, so responsible, his focus so inward and serious. The first time she'd ever met him, he had been playing chess on his own on the terrace of Beechbrook House. She'd since discovered that it was something he often did, in a bid to improve his game. At least if he was breeding guinea pigs with his friend Jack, he would be connecting with kids his own age. Remembering the link he'd sent her, she clicked on it and was transported to what turned out to be a 30-second video of Bill, the brilliant breakdancing guinea pig. Bill turned out to be a white guinea pig with a black patch over one eye, jumping up and down to breakdancing music, while a teenage boy laughed uproariously in the background. It was the laughter that was the funniest part. No wonder Archie had loved it. There was nothing wrong with his sense of humour, that was for sure. Phoebe headed home feeling uplifted. If she wasn't going to see Rufus, she'd get a bath and an early night. She could do with a good night's sleep. Chapter 4. The blare of Phoebe's mobile woke her up at 3 a.m. She'd been in the middle of a garish dream about a coony pig called Boris and a breakdancing animal behaviourist in red stilettos. She answered her phone blearily. Being on 24-hour call was one of the downsides of being a vet, although to be fair, there weren't many call-outs in the small hours. Puddleduck Vets, can I help? She forced herself to sound wide awake and energetic. The woman's voice was quiet, but full of urgency. Hi, Phoebe, it's Sarah Mansfield from Puddleduck Farm at Burley. I'm so sorry to get you up, but we've got a difficult calving. It's a breech. She's struggling. Our dairyman's tried, but he can't manage. We're worried we're going to lose her. Absolutely no problem. Phoebe was already pulling on her work clothes, folded by the bed ready in case of emergency. I can be with you in just over half an hour. Great. The woman sounded heartily relieved. I'll get my dairyman to meet you at the gate. Puddleduck Farm was a huge dairy farm on the edge of Burley. It was just a 19-minute drive from Woodcutter's cottage where Phoebe lived. The advantage of no traffic was negated by the fact she had to take extra care. Animals were harder to see on the forest roads in the darkness. Fortunately, it was a clear night with a full moon, and Phoebe drove as quickly as she dared, and was at Middlebrook just inside half an hour. As Sarah Mansfield had promised, there was someone waiting to meet her, flashing a torch as she approached the gate, and a few minutes later, they were both tramping across a field. I'm afraid she's outside. The dairyman filled her in as they went. I tried to get her in earlier, but it was too late. Can you do a C-section in the field? Phoebe swallowed. Yes, if we have to. There was a higher risk of infection in a field, higher risk of injury and death, but if the dairyman said it was too late to move the cow, it probably was. I've tried a normal delivery, it's not... Phoebe didn't argue with him. She knew they'd have tried everything before calling her. Sometimes she wished farmers didn't try quite so hard and leave things quite so long before calling her out, but she knew why they did. The difference between breaking even and making a profit these days was narrower than it had ever been before. Thankfully, there was a full moon, and Phoebe could hear the diesel thrum of a tractor, the harsh glare of its headlights shining out in the dark, so she wasn't expected to work by moonlight then. Phew. As they got closer, Phoebe heard her patient too. A low, desperate mooing. She was tied to a gate, and there was someone holding her head too. A slim figure silhouetted against the bars, who she realised was Sarah Mansfield, the owner of the farm. The cow was on her feet, but her head was low, and every so often she let out a heartbreaking groan. Okay, I just need to check progress, Phoebe barked instructions as she opened her vet bag and pulled on gloves. Can you get her moved round into the light and hold her tail aside? You're wasting your time, the dairyman replied, doing as she asked with bad grace. Phoebe didn't doubt he was right, but experience had taught her always to check. It was possible a farmer had misread a situation, and she wasn't about to carry out a C-section in the middle of a field unless it was absolutely essential.
"Let her get on with it, Daniel." Sarah spoke for the first time. "Thanks for coming out so quick, lovey."
Phoebe acknowledged the farmer with a grateful nod, but a few minutes later she'd confirmed that on this occasion Sarah's dairyman was right. There was no way this calf was coming out the normal way. Even if it hadn't been breech, it was big. She could feel sweat pouring down her forehead, despite the coolness of the night. She wished Seth, her ex-boss and mentor, was here. But even Seth would have seen this situation as a challenge.
"You're up for this, though?"
Daniel asked her gruffly, and Phoebe could hear the doubt in his voice.
"You've done them before?"
"Of course she's done them before." Sarah Mansfield spoke firmly. "I bet you've done dozens, haven't you, Phoebe?"
"I've done them before," Phoebe said, getting out a local anaesthetic from her bag and administering several shots to her patient in the area she wanted to numb. The truth was she'd done two, and both of them had been carried out in nicely lit, dry stables. The first had been as a student vet, and the second had been when she'd assisted Seth, who'd had years of experience with big animals. The weight of responsibility hung heavy. If this went wrong, both the cow and the calf would die. It wasn't going to go wrong. Sweat poured in her eyes, and she wiped it away. "No, she's fine on her feet. We just need to give that a few minutes to take effect."
"This cow will be dead in a few minutes,"
Daniel said unhelpfully.
"We haven't got time to mess about waiting for things to take effect."
"While we're waiting, we can shift her into the right position so she's side on to the lights," Phoebe told him. "I need to be able to see exactly what I'm doing. I'll need you to scrub in too and help me, and I need somewhere clean to open the C-section kit. We need to keep this as sterile as possible." Daniel did as he was bid, more amenable now he had something to do. They both scrubbed up and donned gowns, and Phoebe shaved off a large area of hair on the cow's skin, through which she would make the incision, and scrubbed it with iodine. She left it as long as she dared before making the cut. Thank God for fast-acting anaesthetics. The cow was distressed enough, but she wouldn't feel a thing with the amount of anaesthetic that had just gone in. "Act confident, Phoebe," she told herself. Acting confident and being bold was half the battle. It helped both the client and their animals to trust you if they thought you knew exactly what you were doing. At least going in from the side, there was room to work. The trick now was to get the calf out and the cow stitched up again as quickly as possible. The faster this happened, the less chance there